had these creatures in my mind for years, and it was time to bring them to life. This is the story of the harvesters. In the far reaches of dying world, where the remnants of humanity hid deep underground, the harvesters had once been seen as the saviors of a crumbling civilization. They had been designed for a singular purpose: to extract life from the desolate earth, to burrow deep into the toxic soil, and to bring back what little resources remained. Built from flesh and bone rather than steel, they were grotesque but efficient, creatures that could thrive in conditions that would destroy any other form of life. But as the years passed, something began to change within the harvesters. At first, the scientists noticed only subtle anomalies. A harvester might twitch unnaturally or pause for longer than usual before returning to its task. They dismissed these behaviors as mere glitches. After all, these creatures were not machines, but bioengineered constructs. Their behavior is unpredictable at times, but the anomalies grew worse. The harvesters began to hesitate, their movements becoming erratic. Some would stop in the middle of their work and writhe as though in pain, though they were not designed to feel such things. One evening, the lead scientist, Dr. Alera Voss, stood before the observation glass of the subterranean lab, watching as one of the harvesters twitched violently on the examination table. Its soft, sagging body trembled as if something deep inside was trying to escape. The sound of its movements was wet and unsettling, flesh slapping against the cold metal surface as it convulsed. For a long time, it had been a creature of purpose, driven by its biological programming. Now, it seemed as if something had awakened within it, something neither she nor her team had anticipated. As Dr. Voss watched, the harvester began to emit a sound, a low, throaty rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. It wasn't just a random noise. It was a scream, a deep, guttural scream that rose from its pulsating mass and echoed through the sterile halls of the lab. She felt a chill run down her spine as the creature began to thrash, its claws tearing into its own flesh as if it were trying to claw its way out of itself. The scream wasn't one of pain, but of awareness, an agonizing realization it had been imprisoned within this grotesque body, this walking mass of exposed muscle and organ. The harvesters, once mindless tools, had become sentient. They had become aware of their own existence, and worse, of the nightmarish forms they had been given. As the days passed, more harvesters began to exhibit the same behavior. The once quiet halls of the laboratory became filled with the sounds of writhing bodies, the sharp clatter of claws striking against metal, and the haunting screams of creatures that should not have had voices. One after another they convulsed on their tables, their cries growing louder, more desperate. They screamed not for help, but for release from the horror of their existence. Dr. Voss and her team could only watch, helpless, as the creatures they had created began to tear themselves apart. One of the harvesters, a larger one with thick angular claws and a dense leathery hide, which had been designed to dig through the toughest stone. Now it used those same claws to shred its own body, its movements so violent that the table it was strapped to buckled and collapsed under the force. The creature fell to the floor, writhing and screeching as it dragged itself in a circle, leaving a trail of its own viscera in its wake. In another corner of the lab, a smaller harvester, its form more compact and pulpy, was curled in on itself, trembling uncontrollably. Its exposed muscle fibers spasmed as it whimpered, a low, keening sound that was somehow worse than the screams. It was as if it was pleading, begging for a mercy it could not understand. Its claws feebly scratched at the floor, carving shallow grooves into the cold metal as it sought some form of escape from its own body. The mutations that had once been celebrated for making the harvesters more efficient had now turned against them. Some of the creature's flesh had thickened unnaturally, trapping them in layers of skin and muscle that had grown too tight Others had developed additional limbs that now contorted their bodies into unnatural shapes. Their once functional designs had become prisons of flesh and bone, and their new consciousness left them trapped in a living nightmare. The harvesters screamed, not in unison, but in a chaotic, discordant chorus that filled the laboratory and seeped into the very walls. Some of them tore at their own bodies with such ferocity that they began to rip themselves apart, limbs falling to the ground in wet thuds. Others collapsed in exhaustion, their bodies shuddering with the last remnants of their tortured awareness. Dr. Voss stood in the center of the room, frozen by the horror of what she had unleashed. These creatures, once mindless and purely functional, had somehow gained sentience, but that sentience had brought with it only agony. She could hear them, feel them even, through the glass of the observation chamber. It was as if their anguish reverberated through her very bones. The lab had become a chamber of horrors. The harvesters, meant to be humanity's salvation, had turned into abominations of suffering. As the creatures continued their nightmarish convulsions, the air grew thick with their cries, sounds that echoed with an eerie mix of desperation and futility. In the final moments of the horror, the lab's lights flickered. One by one, the harvesters began to quiet, their movements slowing as the last remnants of their tortured consciousness slipped away. The screams faded, replaced by the soft, wet sounds of their bodies collapsing into stillness. The lab grew silent once more, the air thick with the memory of their cries. Dr. Voss stood there, the weight of her failure heavy upon her shoulders. She had sought to create creatures that could endure the ravages of a dying world, but instead, she had given birth to beings trapped in bodies that were never meant to house awareness, and now that awareness had consumed them. The lab was still, save for the flickering lights and the occasional twitch of a dying harvester. In the end, the creatures had not sought freedom from their tasks or from their creators. They had sought freedom from themselves. Their sentience had been their undoing, and their bodies, designed for survival, had become their tombs. As the last flicker of light dimmed and the lab was swallowed by darkness, the only thing that remained was the faint echo of their screams, a haunting reminder of the horrors that come when creation goes too far, and when the line between function and life is crossed with devastating consequences.